So what's the big deal? Are artist quality paints really worth it? Join me today while I put it to the test. Hi, my name is Rhonda and welcome to my studio. Today I'm going to put some paints to the test and show you what my opinion is of different levels of paint. So I'm going to show you some super cheap paints that come from, I actually bought them at the dollar store. I'm going to show you some crafter paints, so they're just a little bit more expensive. I also have some basic acrylics that I bought at Walmart that are relatively cheap as well, but not a liquid paint. And then I have a student grade paint, and then I have my artist quality heritage paints. So I'm going to do a little demonstration for you. I'm going to show you all the paints and give you some information about them. And then I'm going to actually paint a rose with each one. So these are the cheapest ones. They're Artist Series acrylic paints. These I bought at the dollar store for, it was $2 for a pack of 10. So each of these tubes is less than 2 cents per milliliter. So that's, I've listed them here. This was $2 for 10 tubes, so less than 2 cents per milliliter. Then I am going to use the folk art paints. These are the liquid acrylics that you can get relatively cheap. I paid $2 each for a 60 milliliter bottle of it. So again, these ones are right around 2 cents per milliliter. Then I have the Galeria and Rowney Simply acrylics. These I bought at Walmart. They're $4 for this big 250 milliliter tube of it. And so again, that's less than 2 cents per milliliter. So those three are kind of this is your super cheap. And then these two, which are also basically similarly priced, are the ones that you typically find at, like just a regular store, not even an art store. So I'm going to try those ones. And then I have the Windsor Newton Galeria acrylics. These are the student grade ones. So they're the ones that I started with when I first started painting. Well, when I first stepped up from the folk art type paints. So I went to these ones. These ones, I bought these little tubes here for about $7 for 60 milliliters. So that works out to about 12 cents a milliliter. And then my artist quality paints, which are my heritage paints, the heritage multimedia paints. I buy them in these little jars. So I pay about, once I convert it to Canadian dollars, I pay about $17.20 for the 118 milliliter jar, which works out to about 15 cents per milliliter. So what I'm going to start with is I'm going to take each of these reds and I'm going to just squirt a little bit out on here, show you the consistency of it, and then I'm also going to show you, I'll just paint it out a little bit and we can kind of have a look at what it looks like color wise and everything. So this is the Artist Series. The only red that they had in that set is vermilion, but again, it has no pigment information, so I know nothing about it. So we're going to just squirt a little bit of that out and see what it looks like. So there's a little bit of that out on my board. And we're going to take the folk art here, which they say to shake up. Folk art, I grabbed the lipstick red because that was one of the nicer looking reds that I had. But again, no information on the pigment, so I'm not sure. So this is definitely a liquid acrylic there as well. So then this is the Brilliant Red from Dollar Rowney, and this one here does say it is a Naphthol Red PR112. So we'll squirt a little bit of that out. There. And then I have the Windsor Newton Galeria. This is a cadmium red hue. So again, it's a PR 112, so it's not actually cadmium red, it's actually a naphthol red. And then we have my Heritage Naphthol Red Light, which is a PR9. I do also have a Naphthol Red, which is a, but it leans a little bit more to the violet, so I wanted to kind of stick more on this side here. So there's that one. Okay, so here we have the Artist Series Vermilion. One thing I'm actually kind of surprised about is how thick it actually is. That's kind of, I was not expecting that from a cheap paint. Spread that out a little bit. Yeah. So it's actually fairly thick for a super cheap paint. Okay, here we have the Folk Art Lipstick Red. That's a little bit more of a watery paint. Okay, this is the Dollar Rowney Simply. Again, quite liquidy. I'm finding that this one and the Folk Art are right now the most liquidy paints. Okay, now the Windsor Newton Galeria. Now the first thing that I'm already noticing with this one is look at how much thicker that is. And just the brightness of the color is a much nicer color and consistency to the paint. It's a smoother consistency. And I think with this one you could probably get more texture into it than you could with either of those other ones. And here's the Naphthol Red Light. And again, the very first thing that I notice here is how beautifully thick this is and smooth. You can get a lot of paint and get it to really stand up where you want it to. So you could get a lot of texture with this paint compared to those other ones. It's a very nice thick paint. So that's kind of your look at the differences from a high level view. So what is the difference in paints? What makes a paint, like for example, these ones here, these are the they're Artist Series acrylics. They call them professional quality, but I paid $2 for 10 tubes. So here's an ultramarine blue. This cost me basically 2 cents for this tube. This is an ultramarine blue from my artist quality paints. This one cost me, I believe this jar was about $14 American, so that's about 16 bucks American for me. What's the difference? Other than obviously size, but what is the difference? So one of the first things that you need to understand about paint is that there's 3 things that go into acrylic paint. There is your pigment, which is what gives it its color. There is binders, which hold everything together, and then there's some fillers. And all paints have some fillers in them. But what you will find is that the pigment is the most expensive part of the paint. Good quality pigment is not cheap. So what you will find with these cheap paints is that there is far less pigment in them and a lot more filler. Sometimes even up to like half of this tube could be filler. Whereas these expensive artist quality paints, these have a lot of pigment in them. They're very highly pigmented. So you know that your pigment is going to last. The other thing about the pigments in these, the artist quality paints will usually have the genuine pigment in them. So this one here has PB29, which is the ultramarine blue pigment. You can find it on a pigment wheel. You know that that's what's in this. This paint that calls itself ultramarine blue has zero information on it. There is nothing. Even when you look online, I looked online on trying to find their webpage and and whatever, and there is no information on this paint. So you don't know if it's actually ultramarine blue in here because there's no information on the pigment. The name of a paint isn't really important. We call this ultramarine blue. This one here is called Hansa yellow. You know, even when I look at these Windsor Newton Galeria ones, okay? So this one here is a cadmium red hue. But if you look at the pigment is actually PR112, which is the same as like a naphthol red. You can name a paint anything. There is no standards for the naming of paint, but there is standards for the pigments that are used. So if you don't know, if you just know that they call this an ultramarine blue, but you don't know what's in it, it could be any pigments making this up. They could be super cheap pigments. They could be anything making this up. You don't know what's in this. This, I know what's in it. This, I know what's in it. So that's one of the top things that I would say about picking your paints is knowing what the pigment is. And why is the pigment important? Okay, so there's a few reasons why pigment is important. One is if you know your pigment, you can look on a color wheel that's set up for pigments. You can look them up online. There's pigment wheels, and then you know exactly where that paint lies on the wheel. So for example, this one here, I know it's a PR112. Well, my pigment wheel tells me that that is almost a pure red because it's right at the top of the pigment wheel. If I have like my naphthol red light here, that's a PR9, I can find that on the pigment wheel, and I know that that is more of a red orange on the pigment wheel without looking at the name. I don't have to know the name of the paint because different companies will use different names for the same pigment, but I know where this sits on the color wheel, so I know what effect it's going to have if I mix it with something. So for example, you know, we say, okay, red and blue should make a nice violet, right? Well, PB29, which is a blue violet, and PR9, which is a red orange, will not make a nice violet because they're on opposite sides of the color wheel, so they will get muddy on you. Whereas if I had something more like the PR112, which is, in this case, they call it a cadmium red hue. This is a PR112, which sits more towards actual red. It doesn't have the orange component to it. This mixed with an ultramarine blue, PB29, will make a much nicer violet because they're closer on the color wheel. They're more related to each other. So that's where pigment is very important. The other thing that's important for you to know about pigments is if you're using actual pigments, which are like if you're using the artist quality paints that have the actual pigments in them and not just not substitutes, some of those pigments are toxic. So this here is a cadmium red hue. Now when they add hue to it, that means that it does not have cadmium red pigment in it. So this is actually a PR112, which is not a cadmium red pigment, and that's a good thing because cadmium pigments are toxic. So you have to be extremely careful with your cadmium pigments. So that's one reason why I don't use them, because I don't want to use anything that's toxic in my house. So I have bunnies and cats, and I've got a child, and so I don't use anything toxic. So that's something for you to understand, is why it's important to know your pigments. One thing I would like to suggest to people as a good resource is this book here. It's called The Artist's Guide to Selecting Colors. It's by Michael Wilcox. I actually ordered this one straight off of their website. Michael Wilcox, let's see, what's it called? It's Michael Wilcox School of Color. That's what it's called. I ordered this one right off of there, and you can get it on Amazon, but I think it was quite a bit more expensive on Amazon, at least up in Canada here. But this book actually goes into all of the pigments, tells you about them, tells you about their toxicity, all kinds of stuff, but he also tells you a lot about what makes up paint. And it's an excellent, excellent book if you want to get to know more about pigments. So I've got a board here. This is just a plain 1/8 inch hardboard that I typically do my roses on. I have it colored with just a gray background. I'm going to use my number 8 Fusion Flat, which is the one I usually use to paint my roses. I use an 8 or a 10 normally. And since these are smaller squares, so the roses will be a little smaller, I decided to go with an 8. So let's start with this one. So I'm going to put out some red. And we'll put out some yellow. This one they call lemon yellow, but I have no idea what it actually is. The only blue that they had in there was ultramarine. The reason I'm putting out a blue for this one actually is because there's no violet in there. And I need a violet for my rose, so I'm going to put out some blue and then I'll mix a violet. Attempt to anyway. And then of course we're going to need some titanium white. Oh god, this is funny. Okay, I'm going to take like a whole bunch of paint and it does nothing. All right, this is entertaining. Honestly, it feels like you could just rub this paint right off. I would not try and layer with this paint. So the first thing that I noticed about this paint was that contrary to how it looked on the palette when I first set it out, it was incredibly thin. It was very watery and there was really nothing to it once you started to spread it out and try and mix it. It pretty much disappeared as quickly as I could put it on when I started actually painting on the board. And there was really nothing to move with my fingers, no matter how thick I tried to put it on. There was nothing there. So you can't layer with this paint at all. It is virtually impossible. To be quite honest, it was the worst paint that I've ever painted with, and I would not recommend it if you want to try and paint roses or, well, pretty much anything. So that was my thoughts on the dollar store paint. All right, number 2, we are going to try the folk art paint. So I grabbed, now I will say that I didn't have any yellow folk art, so I'm going to use this Deco Art bright yellow because I didn't have any folk art yellow, but it's very similarly priced. and it's a liquid paint, as you can see. So I got yellow, I've got lipstick red, I took the True Burgundy for my violet. And I have a vintage white, because I don't actually have a regular white. You got to use your finger in this paint and it just rubs right off. If you want to see the techniques that I'm using to paint the roses, I'll put a link here to one of my rose tutorials for you to check out. So if you look at these two side by side, you'll see that the folk art paint was a little bit better than the dollar store paint, but it's still so thin that you can't really get any movement or texture to it. The dollar store paint had pretty much started to disappear as I went, but the folk art paint did stick around better, but it was just extremely thin. Also, the color mix for that initial orange I thought was a really ugly color, and part of the problem there is, again, no pigment info, so I wasn't sure what pigments I was actually mixing, so I couldn't predict what color I would actually get. So overall, I would say that this paint is slightly better than the dollar store, but still not much. It kind of wanted to rub off when I tried to move it with my finger, and it was just way too thin to do proper techniques with. One of the other really important things about paint that you should know as an artist is the light fastness of the paint. So paints, when they are subjected, the pigments when they're subjected to light, some of them will fade. Those are known as fugitive pigments. And the ASTM has a standard of pigment for pigments, and so if a paint company follows the ASTM standard, then you can trust that the numbers that they have on them or on their website are accurate. So a light fastness of 1 or 2 is generally considered good quality, so they're the ones that are suitable for art. So if you don't know, like say for example, again, this one here, or even these ones, the little folk art paints, these are your crafter's paints. And if you're just painting for yourself and painting for craft and whatever, that's totally fine. But if you want to know that your paint is going to last, you need to know the light fastness of it. Now this here, it basically, it doesn't say anything on it about light fastness, and I looked online and I couldn't find any information on the light fastness of these paints. So you don't know for sure what the light fastness is. My heritage paints on their website, you can look them up, and they're all listed as class 1, which is light fast and it's good for 100+ years. So when you use this kind of paint, you know that your painting is going to last. So if you're just painting, you know, for yourself for fun and whatever, and it doesn't matter to you, that's one thing. But if you want to make sure that your painting actually lasts, then you're going to want to make sure that you have something that you know is light fast. The other thing that you find with different paints of different qualities is that the actual brightness of the paint and its thickness will be different. Your cheaper, more fluid paints like the crafters paints, these paints are going to be a lot more fluid, and so you're not going to be able to get texture with them the way you would with a more expensive paint. So that's just another thing that you have to consider if you want to get texture in your painting. You're not going to get it with like a fluid acrylic. So that's another consideration that you have to put in when you're thinking about what techniques you're going to use for your paint. It's something to consider when you decide what type of paint you want to buy. So if you're enjoying this video, make sure that you like and subscribe down below, and also check out all the links that I have down below to the different products and to my social media and my art pages. Paint number 3 is the Simply Acrylic from Rowney. This one, like I say, at least it tells you the pigment number on it, and it does it says it has 3 stars of permanence, which is not overly permanent, but it's not going to last 100 years. So I've got yellow. This is just a medium yellow, it calls it, which is or it's a PY74 and a PY83 mixed together. I've got the red here, Brilliant Red, which is a PR112, which is a Napsol red. Now for this one here, again, I'm going to have to put out a bit of blue because I don't have any violet. So we'll make our own violet. And then I have a big container of the white, because this is the paint that I typically use for my art journal when I'm just messing around and want to use cheap paint. So that's why I have a giant thing of white. It's not the world's prettiest violet, but there were limited choices for the colors I could choose from, and really I've got a this is like it's a PB15, so it's kind of a green or a blue green, and then the red is straight up red, so it's a very tertiary color. It's kind of gone very tertiary. Put a little more red in it maybe. So taking a closer look at this paint, you can see that it's still very thin and it's quite a liquid style of paint. It is a bit thicker than the other two, so I would consider it to actually be a little bit better than the other two, but not by a lot. You can see how these other two are drying down now, but this one here, you're not going to be able to get much texture on it. It's still an extremely thin paint. When I try to move it with my fingers, it doesn't move very nicely, and you can see the finger marks where I don't want them versus seeing them where I do, which is something that I find with the thicker paints. You have way more control over what movements you're leaving on those petals and whether you're actually seeing fingerprints or if you're seeing actual paint movement. So in this case, again, I would say that it's a little better, but not significantly better than the other two. Now we're going to try the Windsor Newton. So I've got cadmium yellow pale hue. I'm going to put these down here so you can see them. I have cadmium red hue. Because again, I tried to find ones that were similar to what I had, so that they're fairly comparable. This is a permanent magenta, and it's a PR122 PV19, so it's kind of between a quinacridone and a red violet, and I'm using my red violet in my expensive ones, so I thought it was a suitable color. And then some titanium white. So these are the student quality paints, and I'm a little more hopeful that they'll be a little more interesting. First thing that I notice over the dollar store paints is that I can definitely get this paint to go on a little thicker, which is nice. It gives you a little bit more to move around. In order to get the real movement to your petals, you really need to have enough paint on there that you can actually move it. And with this, I'm finding it's a struggle. Like, I'm not cheaping out on the paint on my brush either. I'm putting lots on there. So So here's the results of the Windsor Newton paint. It was actually quite a bit thinner than I expected, so it was hard to get the movement into the petals. It was also more watery on the palette than I had expected, based on the initial test there where I had put it down and then moved it around with a palette knife. It was definitely better than the other three, but I was quite surprised at how hard it was to get the paint to go down in a thick layer. I think you might actually have more trouble than I had expected getting textures with this paint, because even though I used a lot of it on my brush, it just didn't really want to layer up nice on the board. So it was, like I say, it was definitely better than the other three, but it definitely held some surprises for me. And now we're going to do our final paint, which is the artist quality. So here I have my PY74. That's a yellow. And my Nephthol red light. And I've got red violet PB19. And I have titanium white PW6. Almost done this titanium white of mine. All right. So the first thing I immediately notice is that this paint is way thicker. Much, much thicker. See how much better I can actually move the paint around and how much more movement I can get in it. So here's a close-up of the heritage paint now, and you can see how much thicker it actually is than the other paints that I tried. It actually also feels smoother, which I don't know if you can tell through the camera, but it feels a lot smoother going on, and I'm actually able to get some texture, which means that I can also get movement to my petals because there's actually something to push around. If you compare it with the Windsor Newton one here beside it, it's much more highly pigmented, so I can get better color with the same amount of paint or less. And again, I've got a lot more texture using less paint than what I did with the other one. So it's definitely a higher quality paint and better for these techniques. Compared to the cheap paints, there is no comparison. This paint is so much easier to use, so much easier to get the techniques that you want to get with it. It's just like night and day. And compared to the Windsor Newton, which is, slightly more expensive, it's something that I just notice
really clearly how much thicker and smoother and highly pigmented it is than the student quality paint. So hopefully you can see the differences here in my comparisons.
As for myself, what I started out using back when I first got into painting was just the cheap folk art craft paints, because I was just doing craft type painting. I still actually use these in my art journals because I don't want to use my expensive paints for that sort of thing. So these cheap little folk art paints, those are the ones that I used for that. Then when I stepped up my game a little bit, I moved up to the Windsor Newton Galeria acrylics. These worked pretty good for me. I didn't have any issues with them when I was doing my decorative painting. And I started out doing my landscapes with this type of paint. In August of last year, I moved up to artist quality paints, but I have noticed a huge difference in my art since I moved up to the artist quality paints. The pigment in them is a lot stronger, and there's less filler in them, which makes them a very good quality paint. They're light fast, good for over 100 years without fading. Just very good quality paints, and they are specifically designed for the techniques that I do with the roses. So that's why these are my choice of paints. And as far as I'm concerned, for the quality that you get, the price is not that high. The other thing I like about these is that they call them a multimedia acrylic, because they're designed fresh out of the jar or the tube. They're a straight acrylic, but they also have a watercolor medium that I can use to turn these into watercolors. And they have extender, which extends the drying time while keeping it a thinner paint, and a new open medium that works with them really well, that basically gives it the consistency of an oil paint. So I like the fact that I have full control over the with these paints. I have full control over my art. So I will put links to all of the paints in the description box down below, and you can check them out. And let me know in the comments section what types of paint you normally use. And why don't you tell me also the most expensive paint you've ever tried. Here's the most expensive paints I've ever bought. This is the Heritage Cerulean Blue and the Heritage Paranone Orange. And these two paints, the pigment that they use in these paints, the natural pigment in them that they use, for this one here, it's a PB35, and this one's a PO43. Those pigments are very expensive pigments, and because this paint is highly, highly pigmented, these little tubes here, they're let's see, 2.5 fluid ounce or 75 milliliter tubes. These were 17 bucks American, which works out to around 23 bucks Canadian. So that's probably the most expensive paint that I've ever bought and used. So I kind of treat these ones a little more precious than I do the others. The white one that I get in the big 8-ounce jar, that I go through those like crazy. That's why I buy them in the big 8-ounce jar. These ones I'm a little more precious with. So if you enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe to my channel, and I will be producing more videos for you. I'm putting out one video a week, and then I'll have a few little extra tips and that sort of thing that I'll put out occasionally as well. So give me a like and a subscribe, and come on back and check out some more of my videos. I just wanted to invite you to, if you want to get to know a little bit more about me, check out, I'll put a link here to my artist interview. So it's a bunch of questions and what my feelings are on them, where I get my inspiration, my advice for beginners, all that sort of thing. So make sure you check that one out too.